You're listening to HowStreet.com radio, available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. Welcome to HowStreet.com radio, the online source for market opinions. Here is Jim Goddard.
My guest is Danielle Park, editor of the popular blog Juggling Dynamite and president of Venable Park Investment Council Incorporated. Danielle, today maybe we're not just going to dwell on the negative, but there's some good positive things too that you'd like to talk about. What's the first one?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, you know, with all the press about the water shortage in California, and it's really getting attention because it's such a massive farming region. They export so many things to the rest of the world. And, you know, it really puts a spotlight on the fact that 70% of global water consumption comes into the agricultural sector, and that you know, smarter policies there in terms of recycling water and using less are going to be pivotal to the new economy going forward and, you know, basically sustainability of life on the planet. So I think it's really important that although the shortage is dominating the news, that we talk about all the intelligent things that are being designed and evolved to, you know, reduce, reuse, and recycle in the water space as well as so many other places. So I put on some articles today about, you know, there's companies who are doing purification of livestock farming water, so they're reclaiming, you know, the water literally out of manure and breaking it back down into, you know, the components, the phosphates, the things that are needed for specific fertilization in certain crops, and then they're pumping out potable water at the end of it. So instead of dumping all that back into our major waterways, you know, like every year the Great Lakes, Lake Erie, they all kind of go toxic with, you know, too much phosphorus or whatever else comes off the runoff from farming. And it's not necessary because we have this technology that can now clean the water, you know, break it down, as I say, and then recycle it back into fresh water that can either go back into our water systems or literally be consumed or reused in other industries. Or by people. So that's really exciting stuff. And, you know, even the whole evolution of farming as we know it, the vertical farming trend is really becoming a worldwide push because it makes so much sense, Jim. You know, I put another article on about the Montreal-based urban farms, which actually came from, I think it was Burnaby. It was out in British Columbia originally, and it partnered in the last year or so with McGill University for their research side. And
yes, I did a story on that about 6 months ago with one of my information sources, Martin Element, and he was very excited about that.
Well, it's so smart. It just makes so much sense. They use 94% less water than conventional methods, and they get nearly 300 times the yield from equivalent space. You know, all that coupled with the fact they can farm 365 days of the year with no pesticides whatsoever, a fraction of the energy costs, which it's electrically generated equipment, which can then, of course, plug into a green grid, either on-site or, you know, from solar and other passive energies on-site, or by, you know, just plugging into the grid where we're pumping greener energy to the grid. So it's just it's not only, you know, better for costs, it's better for nutrition because the food is literally picked in the morning and, you know, consumed in the afternoon, so to speak, in grocery stores and restaurants. So there's so much less waste. It doesn't spend 10 days, you know, tracking across North America to get from a producer in Mexico to a table in, you know, Ontario or British Columbia. So, you know, that's all extremely important. And it really ties in, Jim, to the other story which we were talking about, which is the recent study by Statistics Canada on the weight factor in Canadians. So we've heard a lot about, you know, American overweight issues in the past few years and how 2/3 of Americans are now considered overweight or obese, but you don't often see the statistics on Canadians, and people have often said to me, well, Canada's much better, and I would just say anecdotally, looking around, I don't think Canadians are that much better, you know, weight-wise or health-wise, and in fact, this study done by StatsCan published 2013 survey results, and they said on the, you know, standard criteria of BMIs and other indicators that 53.6% of Canadians were either considered overweight or obese, and then they give the breakdown across the country. And interestingly, British Columbia comes in at the leanest. 46.9% of people considered overweight. I mean, still pretty high, not good, would like to see it lower, but overall much leaner than their counterparts in the East, where the Maritimes have, anywhere from 60 to 69% overweight and obese populations. If you look at that, it's very much to do with how much locally grown food is available, fresh food. So in British Columbia, you have a much longer season of growing. In the province, you have a lot of fresh food, fresh fish, all that Granville Market stuff, all wonderfully available inside an urban environment. And so that, not only that, but mobility also, outside more or less extreme weather conditions, able to cycle and walk a lot more, not to mention all the other, more the sort of skiing and all that great activity that you have on the West Coast. But they've done other studies, and there was another company out of the University of Western Ontario, which is doing research on what they call the geography of obesity. And they basically go around and look at different cities and sectors and give them a obesogenic indicator or reading. And that is basically looks at, things like mobility, junk food swamps, they call it, how much city centers are organized around, fast junk food, and how easy it is to get access to freshly produced local foods. That all impacts the health of the individual. So they're introducing this whole new component into urban planning, which is really exciting. It makes so much sense, right? So, we've got this theme now of just more intelligent solutions for putting energy into the grid, for reduce, reuse, recycle, and for putting better energy into human bodies. And just a realization that unless we do that, the systems that we have in place are not going to be sustainable. The energy systems we're currently using are not sustainable, and the health epidemic is not sustainable, right? The related condition, the dilapidation of the population in terms of physicality and output and all that, and the healthcare system simply, cannot absorb unless people start pushing back the other direction. So anyway, I think it's really important that when we talk about some of the problems and things that go wrong every day, and certainly the finance sector gives us enormous food for discussion of all the things that are wrong in the world, but there's all these really exciting things that are happening too, and I think that gives me personally great hope.
I know in a past interview you talked about a new lighting source that's more efficient than our compact fluorescent bulbs.
Oh, well, LED lighting, for example, they're using in the vertical farming. Again, much more efficient. They can have it on 24 hours a day. They don't have to wait for the sun. So it just increases yield. And again, because it's electrically fueled, people often say to me, and it's so silly, they'll say, well, that's not any better because you're plugging into a dirty grid. It's like, well, we're putting different energy into the grid. The whole point about this is transforming the grid. Electric cars, of course, if they're just plugging into coal-fueled, the old usual sources, are not going to be particularly green because they're using that other energy. But if you are pumping green energy to the grid, you've got a whole different kettle of fish. So I think the more things that, again, it's all these things together, Jim, which make the solutions. It's not one or the other, and I don't know how many people waste their energy sending me emails about, global warming is a fiction, and they write me this big thing about global warming being this, contrived theory of whatever, Nazis or whatever. Like, they just have these whole contingents they go off on about trying to prove why that's not true, and I keep saying, I personally don't care whether that is true. I happen to think it is, but that is not the main motivation for all this brilliant and revolution that's going on. It's because it just makes so much more sense on every level in terms of wasting less money, more efficiency, making our resources last and not run out, not exploiting things so that they're literally used up, but that they're there for generations to come. And then our own health is served by all these intelligent things that we're figuring out. So I think we're going to look back on this time and think, how could we have been so dumb and so wasteful? And yet every day I see signs that the penny's dropping all over the place, and that's really wonderful. I say it's a very exciting time to be alive.
Well, I think in 50 years, people will say, you burned petroleum to power your vehicles. It's so much more valuable for other things, like pharmaceuticals and plastics and so on. And also here in Vancouver, a charity is now collecting all the plastic jugs and bottles that wash up on the seashore, and they're reconverting it to crude oil. And they're making a profit doing that.
And I saw some people that were making home kits of breaking down plastics in literally their own sort of stills at home, if you will, and using that as fuel for their cars. So I think, I do think plastic is a major issue because, again, unless we're going to have a very intelligent collection and recycling program, it is ending up just washing up on the shores and sort of left, and it will not break down in its natural course. So I think we're going to have to get away from using even, oil-based products for mass containers the way we presently are. But here's one of the things, the less we're shipping things across continents and between countries, the less packaging we even need. So I think this all feeds into this back to a more local focused production of everything that's consumable. I look around and I see all these massive big box stores, and the data every week comes in that retailers are having trouble, that retail sales are in decline. It makes sense because there was this big push for consumption on debt. That's kind of in the rearview mirror now, although Canada's slow to go into reverse, but I think that's already in progress. And as that happens, you're going to see, just empty space left and right, all these big box stores that no one is going to want to consume enough to support anymore. Then we can use some of that square footage for things like vertical farming, which would be much more intelligent, and it brings revenue back into the local community, which is so important. I think I'm a very big believer in secular cycles and shifts in humanity's behavior, and I think we've been through this very dark period. I think we'll seriously look back in history and think it's been a very dark time, and that now we have the opportunity to go exactly in the other direction for a while. You're getting a much more socialist focus, and I mean that in a small s way. I mean that in a greater scrutiny of the adoration of corporations and a sense of what makes sense for the community and the individual family, much more than the extractors of wealth who take it all out of the system through these corporations that have been really dominant in the past 100 years, So I think it's again, it'll go probably very far the other way eventually, and we'll have to sort of reestablish some more median trends in this stuff, but we have gone so far astray, so far the other way, that I think now people are starting to rethink. And I go back to a very simple concept. It comes about when a line of credit is no more. And this is the experience for individuals as well. QE really added credit to the world, like $60 trillion more in available credit after the credit bubble in 2008 burst. And so habits just perpetuated really in the wrong direction, the direction they shouldn't have been going, and the reason we got into the trouble in 2008 was really perpetuated again over the last 6 years with bells on, and so until that whole faith falls out of the central banking system and people stop seeing monetary tricks as the solution to our problems, which I think we are literally at today. I think everybody's increasingly skeptical. The data keeps coming in horrific. If you look at the Greek situation today, they're talking about a 70% probability now that Greece won't repay the IMF's loans. Christine Lagarde actually openly admitted that Greece may be leaving the Eurozone. This is the blink that we've been waiting for. The revelation that there's too much debt and adding more debt to the system is doing nothing. We learned this in the 30s, but we're learning it again today. And after that epiphany takes place, usually in the form of a massive, shock to the system, because either China goes into recession, which no one thinks possible and yet is seemingly happening as we speak, or the Eurozone implodes because, the union falls apart because people can't afford to be, paying these insane levels of debt. One of those shocks is the tipping point. And then finally, it's like everyone declares that emperor nude, and we sort of start getting back to basics. And I think that's where we are today. So it's good. It's good except for the people that don't realize that we've been in this very artificial condition for the past 6 years and are now, fully loaded on risk assets with their life savings again today. And I'm very concerned about those people because many of them are already either in retirement, close to retirement, perhaps have recently inherited money from their elderly parents, There's no way to replace that capital if it gets heavily damaged in this next repricing cycle. And those are the ones that I'm just trying to, make them look at their risk exposure today and realize that we're coming to the end of an era here and that the mean reversion process will reveal probably the best opportunities that we've seen in 20 years, but not if you suffer the losses in the down cycle.
We'll have more with Danielle Park right after this.
More and more people are looking to the Internet for intelligent, riveting, and thought-provoking interviews. To advertise on the Goddard Report and TalkDigitalNetwork.com, call 604-699-8600, 604-699-8600.
Welcome back. We're speaking with Danielle Park. China plans to go from an economy that produces things to a consumer economy. Are they stepping onto the elevator just as the cable is snapping?
Well, they've been trying to do that, Jim, since 2008 when their big customer, the United States housing bubble burst and the consumer credit bubble burst, the derivatives mess and all that, and they had to figure out a way, their largest, Europe and the U.S. went into a big recession. They lost their best clients, and they were trying to figure out how to keep driving that level of growth, how to keep that ball rolling, and said, okay, I know, we'll just stimulate, we'll just borrow a bunch of money, pump tons of debt into the system, and hopefully, we'll re-stimulate and also create enough jobs at home that somehow will miraculously get the Chinese household into full consumption mode. Well, it's never going to happen until their household spending capacity is much higher than it is today. Average household incomes of less than $10,000 a year, Jim, you just are not going to be able to buy anything close to what a Western consumer was spending on credit a few years ago. And they have to save for their, retirement and for their health care and all this stuff. They're very much self-funded. So what China has achieved in this sort of, again, they fully embraced the idea of central control, pump credit and it will grow kind of concept, which has been so prevalent after the 2008 collapse. So what they've successfully done is quadrupled their debt from 2007, and yet their growth is less than half of what it was. So you can just imagine, that just gets to be harder and harder to carry. And so in the last stage of this thing, what's happened is credit pumped into the banking sector, went into a housing bubble in China. Some of that spilled out to other parts in the world, like Vancouver, for example, which had this huge influx of Chinese money, which drove prices there into very high valuations. And then the next stage of that, as that sort of ran its course and Chinese real estate began to weaken, was that they pumped in, they made it easier for individuals to buy stocks. They increased margin, and a whole bunch of people took out applications for trading accounts. And now you've had this whole other resurgence of a bubble in China and the Chinese stock market. And, in the past year, some of their indexes are up 100%, even just year to date. Like, it's just, it's like the tech wreck all over again in China. But that's individuals gambling. That's not people that have, amassed life savings and have strong income and are able to spend and drive their domestic economy. That's just speculation in its most, pure form. And of course, what happens is you get these big pops. Like there was a story of a guy in China this week where he had literally, his Hong Kong electronics company had skyrocketed in the past 5 months, and through his company shares, he'd become suddenly the fourth wealthiest guy in Asia. Well, guess what? In a half hour this week, he lost 95% of his fortune in 1/2 hour because he was in that same crazy stock market, because it's a complete casino. It's completely to do with people gambling on leverage and nothing to do with investing. It's the opposite of what we were talking about in the first part of our conversation about these actual grassroots companies that are, bringing meaningful technology that helps and improves humanity and life and all those things, and they're investing in building something that's got real utility. On the other end of the spectrum is this casino of financial speculation where people have been just running wild with credit and, trying to get rich before it all collapses. So they're really two diametrically opposed things. And so I think China is, if we look at their real-time indicators, their momentum indicators like freight and energy consumption, things that actually give you more of a real-time read on the economic picture, it is far, far below this, quote, 7% official rate that's quoted. It's more like 2.5% growth in those momentum indicators. So it could be that the Chinese economy is growing much lower than the 7% that everyone's sort of penciled in as a status quo. And I think that trend is going to continue to disappoint because of all this. Again, once you got so much credit in the economy and you don't have strong consumption domestically and your global customers are continuing to struggle, you've got a problem because now you're trying to service 4 times more debt with half the revenue and falling, right? So it's really the same. Again, it's the same human behavior that we saw in households, that we've seen in all sorts of companies, and that we see on a country by country basis around the world. So I think that's why I'm optimistic, because the trends were all so wrong in the one direction simultaneously, really. Around the world, I think that the renaissance, the wake-up, the revelations that are happening on an individual and on a city basis, are just happening everywhere at the same time. And everyone's got the same kind of drive and goal, which is let's improve our health, let's figure out ways to spend less and save more, let's do things that actually improve the quality of life rather than just bonus out executives at corporations. And let's try and get this thing back on track. So I think everyone's really focused on the same type of ideas at the same time.
Danielle, always a pleasure chatting with you.
Thank you, Jim.
And what a positive view of the future.
Well, you know what? I am not a pessimist. I have been disappointed profoundly by the way things have gone in the past 6 years since the great crash happened. But I see all sorts of wonderful things happening right now in the world. So I am actually longer term quite optimistic.
My guest has been Danielle Park, editor of the popular blog Juggling Dynamite. She's also the president of Venable Park Investments Council Incorporated. Her website is jugglingdynamite.com. You're listening to HowStreet.com radio. Find us on Twitter at Talk Digital Net. Our YouTube channel is Talk Digital Network. Comments about the show can be sent to info@HowStreet.com. I'm Jim Goddard.
Comments made on HowStreet.com radio are an expression of opinion only and should not be construed in any matter whatsoever as recommendations to buy or sell any financial instrument at any time. Available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. HowStreet.com radio is a production of HowStreet Media Incorporated.